An intellectual is a person who engages in critical study, thought, and reflection about the reality of society, and proposes solutions for the normative problems of that society, and, by such discourse in the public sphere, he or she gains authority within the public opinion, coming from the world of culture either as a creator or as a mediator. The intellectual participates in politics, either to defend a concrete proposition or to denounce an injustice, usually by producing or by extending an ideology, and by defending a system of values. Socially, intellectuals constitute the intelligentsia, a status class organized either by ideology or by nationality. The contemporary intellectual class originated from the intelligentsiya of Tsarist Russia, the social stratum of those possessing intellectual formation, and who were Russian society's counterpart to the German Bildungsbürgertum and to the French bourgeoisie éclairée, the enlightened middle classes of those realms. During the late 19th century, amidst the Dreyfus affair, an identity crisis of anti-Semitic nationalism for the French Third Republic, the reactionary anti-Dreyfusids used the terms intellectual and the intellectuals to deride the liberal Dreyfusids as political dilettantes, for the realms of French culture, art, and science, who had become involved in politics by publicly advocating for the exoneration and liberation of Alfred Dreyfus, a French artillery captain of Jewish descent who was falsely accused of betraying France to Germany. In the 20th century, the term intellectual acquired positive connotations of social prestige derived from possessing intellect and intelligence, especially when the intellectual's activities exerted positive consequences in the public sphere and so increased the intellectual understanding of the public, by means of moral responsibility, altruism, and solidarity, without resorting to the manipulations of populism, paternalism, and incivility. Hence, for the educated person of a society participating in the public sphere, the political affairs of the city-state is a civic responsibility dating from the Greco-Latin classical era. I am a man, I reckon nothing human to be foreign to me. The determining factor for a thinker to be considered a public intellectual is the degree to which he or she is implicated and engaged with the vital reality of the contemporary world, that is to say, participation in the public affairs of society. Consequently, being designated as a public intellectual is determined by the degree of influence of the designator's motivations, opinions, and options of action, and by affinity with the given thinker. Therefore, the intellectual is someone who meddles in what does not concern him. Analogously, the application and the conceptual value of the terms intellectual and the intellectuals are socially negative when the practice of intellectuality is exclusively in service to the establishment who wield power in a society. As such, the intellectuals are specialists in defamation. They are basically political commissars. They are the ideological administrators, the most threatened by dissidents. Noam Chomsky's negative view of the establishment intellectual suggests the existence of another kind of intellectual one might call the public intellectual, which is someone able to speak the truth, a courageous and angry individual for whom no worldly power is too big and imposing to be criticized and pointedly taken to task. The real true intellectual is therefore always an outsider, living in self-imposed exile, and on the margins of society. He or she speaks to, as well as for, a public, necessarily in public, and is properly on the side of the dispossessed, the unrepresented and the forgotten. Terms and endeavors. The intellectual is a specific variety of the intelligent person, which is associated with reason and thinking. Many everyday roles require the application of intelligence to skills that may have a psychomotor component, for example, in the fields of medicine or the arts, but these do not necessarily involve the practitioner in the world of ideas. The distinctive quality of the intellectual person is that the mental skill skills which one demonstrates are not simply intelligent, but even more. They focus on thinking about the abstract, philosophical and esoteric aspects of human inquiry and the value of the thinking. The intellectual and the scholarly classes are related. The intellectual usually is not a teacher involved in the production of scholarship, but has an academic background and works in a profession, practices an art or a science. The intellectual person is one who applies critical thinking and reason in either a professional or a personal capacity, and so has authority in the public sphere of the society. The term intellectual identifies three types of person: one who is erudite and develops abstract ideas and theories; a professional who produces cultural capital, as in philosophy, literary criticism, sociology, law, medicine, science, and an artist who writes, composes, paints, etc. Man of letters. The English term man of letters derives from the French term belletriste, but is not synonymous with an academic. The term man of letters distinguished the literate man from the illiterate man, in a time when literacy was a rare form of cultural capital. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the term belletriste identified the literati, the French citizens of the Republic of Letters, which evolved into the salon, a social institution, usually run by a hostess, meant for the edification, education, and cultural refinement of the participants. Historical background. In English, the term intellectual identifies a literate thinker. Its earlier usage, as in the book titled The Evolution of an Intellectual, by John Middleton Murray, denotes literary activity, rather than the activities of the public intellectual. 19th century Britain. In the late 19th century, when literacy was relatively common in European countries, such as the United Kingdom, the man of letters denotation broadened to mean specialized, a man who earned his living writing intellectually, not creatively. About literature: essayist, the journalist, the critic, al. In the 20th century, such an approach was gradually superseded by the academic method, and the term man of letters became disused, replaced by the generic term intellectual, describing the intellectual person. In late 19th century, the term intellectual became common usage to denote the defenders of the falsely accused artillery officer Alfred Dreyfus, continental Europe. In early 19th century Britain, Samuel Taylor Coleridge coined the term clerisy, the intellectual class responsible for upholding and maintaining the national culture, the secular equivalent of the Anglican clergy. Likewise, in Tsarist Russia, there arose the intelligentsia, who were the status class of white-collar workers. The theologian Alistair McGrath said that the emergence of a socially alienated, theologically literate, anti-establishment lay intelligentsia is one of the more significant phenomena of the social history of Germany in the 1830s, and that 3 or 4 theological graduates in 10 might hope to find employment in a church post. As such, politically radical thinkers already had participated in the French Revolution. Robert Danton said that they were not societal outsiders, but respectable, domesticated, and assimilated. Thenceforth, in Europe, an intellectual class was socially important, especially to self-styled intellectuals, whose participation in society's arts, politics, journalism, and education, of either nationalist, internationalist, or ethnic sentiment, constitute vocation of the intellectual. Moreover, some intellectuals were anti-academic, despite universities being synonymous with intellectualism. In France, the Dreyfus affair marked the full emergence of the intellectual in public life, especially Émile Zola, Octave Mirbeau, and Anatole France directly addressing the matter of French anti-Semitism to the public. Thenceforward, intellectual became common. yet occasionally derogatory, usage. Its French noun usage is attributed to Georges Clemenceau in 1898. Germany. Habermas' structural transformation of public sphere made significant contribution to the notion of public intellectual by historically and conceptually delineating the idea of private and public intellectuals in the East. In Imperial China, in the period from 206 BC until AD 1912, the intellectuals were the scholar officials, who were civil servants appointed by the Emperor of China to perform the tasks of daily governance. Such civil servants earned academic degrees by means of imperial examination, and also were skilled calligraphers, and knew Confucian philosophy. Historian Wing Tsit Chan concludes that, generally speaking, the record of these scholar gentlemen has been a worthy one. It was good enough to be praised and imitated in 18th-century Europe. Nevertheless, it has given China a tremendous handicap in the transition from government by men to government by law, and personal considerations in Chinese government have been a curse. In Joseon, Korea, the intellectuals were the literati, who knew how to read and write, and had been designated as the Chang'an, in accordance with the Confucian system. Socially, they constituted the petite bourgeoisie, composed of scholar bureaucrats who administered the dynastic rule of the Joseon dynasty. Intelligentsia, addressing the role as a social class. Jean-Paul Sartre said that intellectuals have the moral conscience of their age, that their moral and ethical responsibilities are to observe the socio-political moment, and to freely speak to the society in accordance with their consciences. Like Sartre and Noam Chomsky, public intellectuals usually are polymaths, knowledgeable of the international order of the world, the political and economic organization of contemporary society, the institutions and laws that regulate the lives of the layman citizen, the educational systems, and the private networks of mass communication media that control the broadcasting of information to the public, whereas intellectuals, liberals, and democratic socialists usually hold, advocate, and support the principles of democracy, and the improvement of socio-political relations in domestic and international politics. The conservative public intellectuals usually defend the social, economic, and political status quo as the realization of the perfect ideals of Platonism, and present a static dominant ideology, in which utopias are unattainable and politically destabilizing of society. Marxist perspective. In Marxist philosophy, the social class function of the intellectuals is to be the source of progressive ideas for the transformation of society, to provide advice and counsel to the political leaders, to interpret the country's politics to the mass of the population, and, as required, to provide leaders. The Italian communist theoretician Antonio Gramsci developed Karl Marx's conception of the intelligentsia to include political leadership in the public sphere. That, because all knowledge is existentially based, the intellectuals, who create and preserve knowledge, are spokesmen for different social groups, and articulate particular social interests. That intellectuals occur in each social class and throughout the right wing, the center, and the left wing of the political spectrum. That, as a social class, the intellectuals view themselves as autonomous from the ruling class of the society. That, in the course of class struggle meant to achieve political power, every social class requires a native intelligentsia who shape the ideology particular to the social class from which they originated. Therefore, the leadership of intellectuals is required for effecting and realizing social change, because a human mass does not distinguish itself, does not become independent in its own right without, in the widest sense, organizing itself, and there is no organization without intellectuals, that is, without organizers and leaders, in other words, without a group of people specialized in conceptual and philosophical elaboration of ideas. In the pamphlet What is to be Done, Lenin said that vanguard party revolution required the participation of the intellectuals to explain the complexities of socialist ideology to the uneducated proletariat and the urban industrial workers, in order to integrate them to the revolution, because the history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own efforts, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, and will settle for the limited socio-economic gains so achieved. In Russia, as in continental Europe, socialist theory was the product of the educated representatives of the propertied classes, of revolutionary socialist intellectuals, such as were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In the formal codification of Leninism, the Hungarian Marxist philosopher, Georgy Lukács identified the intelligentsia as the privileged social class who provide revolutionary leadership. By means of intelligible and accessible interpretation, the intellectuals explained to the workers and peasants the who, the how, and the why of the social, economic, and political status quo, the ideological totality of society, and its practical, revolutionary application to the transformation of the society. Public intellectual. The term public intellectual describes the intellectual participating in the public affairs discourse of society, in addition to an academic career. Regardless of the academic field of the professional expertise, the public intellectual addresses and responds to the normative problems of society, and, as such, is expected to be an impartial critic who can rise above the partial preoccupation of one's own profession and engage with the global issues of truth, judgment, and taste of the time. Quote, in Representations of the Intellectual, Edward said that the true intellectual is, therefore, always an outsider, living in self-imposed exile, and on the margins of society. An intellectual usually is associated with an ideology or with a philosophy, e.g., the third-way centrism of Anthony Giddens in the Labour government of Tony Blair. The Czech intellectual Václav Havel said that politics and intellectuals can be linked, but that moral responsibility for the intellectual's ideas, even when advocated by a politician, remains with the intellectual. Therefore, it is best to avoid utopian intellectuals who offer universal insights to resolve the problems of political economy with public policies that might harm and that have harmed civil society. That intellectuals be mindful of the social and cultural ties created with the words, insights, and ideas, and should be heard as social critics of politics and power. Social background. The American academic Peter H. Smith describes intellectuals of Latin America as being people from an identifiable social class, who have been conditioned by the common experience, and thus are inclined to share a set of common assumptions, that 94% come from either the middle class or the upper class, and that only 6% come from the working class. In The Intellectual, philosopher Stephen Fuller said that, because cultural capital confers power and social status, they must be autonomous in order to be a credible intellectual. It is relatively easy to demonstrate autonomy if you come from a wealthy or aristocratic background. You simply need to disown your status and champion the poor and downtrodden. Autonomy is much harder to demonstrate if you come from a poorer proletarian background. Calls to join the wealthy in common cause appear to betray one's class origins. The political importance and effective consequence of Émile Zola in the Dreyfus affair derived from being a leading French thinker. Thus J'accuse. His open letter to the French government and the nation proved critical to achieving the exoneration of Captain Alfred Dreyfus of the false charges of treason, which were facilitated by institutional anti-Semitism, among other ideological defects of the French establishment. Academic background. In journalism, the term intellectual usually connotes a university academic of the humanities, especially a philosopher, who addresses important social and political matters of the day. Hence, such an academic functions as a public intellectual who explains the theoretic basis of said problems and communicates possible answers to the policymakers and executive leaders of society. The sociologist Frank Furedi said that intellectuals are not defined according to the jobs they do, but the manner in which they act, the way they see themselves, and the values that they uphold. Public intellectuals usually arise from the educated elite of a society, although the North American usage of the term intellectual includes the university academics. The difference between intellectual and academic is participation in the realm of public affairs. Public policy role. In the matters of public policy, the public intellectual connects scholarly research to the practical matters of solving societal problems. The British sociologist Michael Burawoy, an exponent of public sociology, said that professional sociology has failed by giving insufficient attention to resolving social problems, and that a dialogue between the academic and the layman would bridge the gap. An example is how Chilean intellectuals worked to re-establish democracy within the right-wing, neoliberal governments of the military dictatorship of Chile. The Pinochet regime allowed professional opportunities for some liberal and left-wing social scientists to work as politicians and as consultants, in effort to realize the theoretical economics of the Chicago Boys. But their access to power was contingent upon political pragmatism, abandoning the political neutrality of the academic intellectual. In the sociological imagination, C. Wright Mills said that academics had become ill-equipped for participating in public discourse, and that journalists usually are more politically alert and knowledgeable than sociologists, economists, and especially political scientists. That, because the universities of the U.S. are bureaucratic, private businesses, they do not teach critical reasoning to the student, who then does not know how to gauge what is going on in the general struggle for power in modern society. Likewise, Richard Rorty criticized the participation of intellectuals in public discourse as an example of the civic irresponsibility of intellect, especially academic intellect. The American legal scholar Richard Posner said that the participation of academic public intellectuals in the public life of society is characterized by logically untidy and politically biased statements, of the kind that would be unacceptable academic work, that there are few ideologically and politically independent public intellectuals, and disapproved that public intellectuals limit themselves to practical matters of public policy, and not with values of public philosophy, or public ethics, or public theology, not with matters of moral and spiritual outrage.